Good morning, everyone. Thanks very much for joining us this morning. I'm not going to spend time, we've got very little but very valuable time together. I'm not going to spend time introducing you all. Your biographies are all on the website alongside this presentation. I did want to say at the beginning that I think the focus of this discussion needs to be on how we decarbonise aviation. That's the focus of this week of events that Dcarbonise has organised. There obviously are a number of ways in which that can be achieved, but it's zero carbon is what we're after. International aviation is responsible for 3.5% of the anthropogenic climate forcing, less than Russia, more than Japan. Roland Berger, a respected German consultancy, has suggested that unless the aviation industry changes quite dramatically, it could be accounting for as much as 24% of global emissions by 2050, at which point I think we might see a bit less flying going on. I don't want to see that happen, and I don't imagine that any of you do. So I'd like the focus really to be on how can we reduce carbon from aviation, both in the short term, the medium term, and the long term. But John, could we start with you, because you're a well-known commentator on the state of the aviation industry. What do you see as the response of the mainstream industry? We'll come later to Airbus, but focusing on the other manufacturers and the mainstream airlines, where do you think we've got to?
Well, I think first of all, the industry has finally taken it on board that it is a contributor to the problem. You mentioned about the percentage which it contributes, but that no longer is it acceptable to defend on the basis of the small percentage, as if that justifies the industry continuing as is. I'm very happy to say we've moved beyond that point. Having said that, I think we just need to put in context how important the industry is in the 21st century. We're not talking about the 19th or indeed the 20th century. It's a key part of the economic fabric globally, a massive employer, and of course a major provider of tourism. Over half of tourists in the world, which of course is a big part of what we're talking about, both in terms of sustainable aviation of a WTM, have to travel by air, and where flights are creating emissions, well over 80% of them are distances over 1,500 kilometers where there isn't an alternative. And many markets which have developed from a tourism point of view, and many countries which rely on tourism for their lifeblood, have to have air transport. So that's a situation in terms of industry's importance. We've seen the knock of the last 18 months with the COVID crisis, which is the worst the industry's ever experienced. And of course, it's not over yet for aviation or indeed for tourism more broadly. What it has done, of course, is it's given a massive reduction in aviation emissions. IATA estimates that's around about 60%, but of course that is temporary. But there is a more positive element to that, but it has acted, strangely enough, as a major catalyst to retiring a lot of elderly, more fuel inefficient aircraft, which of course produce more emissions, particularly when we think about long haul aircraft like the Boeing 747 Jumbo or Airbus's equivalent, the A340. These are big, you could say, in relative terms, gas guzzling aircraft with 4 engines that were designed in the 1980s, which certainly are more emissions inefficient. And of course, they're gone right now and not even being replaced with a small level of activity. But when they are progressively replaced, they'll be typically with smaller aircraft with 2 engines, with new engine technology to already improve credentials on a per unit of operation basis. Of course, the challenge is, of course, we're still growing or expect to return to growth, albeit that may be dented. It'll certainly be dented for some years. IATA and other industry bodies see that as being a time to recovery of not before 2024. There are questions of certain airlines who, for example, rely on business travelers. The business travelers, great from an airline's point of view. Typically on long-haul flights, they pay more, they sit in big, comfy seats, but of course that doesn't help in terms of emissions credentials. I personally think we're going to see a realignment of capacity and usage of floor space and productivity flights, which it's hard to quantify, but that's going to be part of the trajectory going forward. And I think, as I mentioned, the industry is now taking this on board. We've just had in the last a week or so, the IATA AGM led by Willie Walsh, the former CEO of IAG. And I know that Willie, when he was CEO of IAG, had already taken on the issue of climate change and aviation's contribution to it very seriously. And he's made clear that while the industry wrestles with COVID, that doesn't mean it can park or abdicate from responsibility on the environment. And so EARTH is playing a very strong role there in pushing the industry forward. But to do so, it's got to be able to engage with governments. This is a really important thing. That the industry has never been notoriously profitable. It hasn't had large resources to invest beyond its own needs. Even replacement of aircraft is a costly exercise. But we cannot continue with the approach of simply a stick approach of governments slapping taxes on aviation, pocketing the proceeds, and never allocating them towards the necessary research and development we require for the future. And I think we're going to hear Woody Walsh and others banging on about this to get a far more collaborative approach. And the industry is not asking for an easy ride. It's asking for the same way we expedited development of vaccines in the context of COVID at a pace we'd never seen before. No, this is a challenge of a much greater scale than the pandemic itself. We need to move as quickly as possible on multiple levels with as much investment as it takes, as much political focus as can be mustered, so that the industry can work to improve its credentials and keep performing that important economic role. And I think we have to see as well that the industry understands there are things that can be done right now. There are things that can be done relatively quickly during the 2020s up to early 2030s, and other things beyond that. It has to be a multifaceted approach. It can't just be a one-shot way of tackling a problem. Right now, I mentioned, we've been looking for years in the US and in Europe at improvements in air traffic control, air traffic management. In the US, we talk about new skies. In Europe, we talk about CESAR, single European sky. If we can make improvements, and really the only impediment is political will, it's not technology. We could cut emissions in Europe based on 2019 levels by potentially 10%, if not more, by aircraft simply operating more efficiently, more directly between points, much less of the wasteful and polluting circling around airports for landing, holding at runway hold points to depart. It's a political effort that is required there. And that's where the industry has to push hard to get that political engagement. If there is a tax take, and I don't see the tax take particularly going away from the industry, then we must see larger amounts invested in new power sources, electric and hydrogen, which definitely are the way of the future. But of course, as I mentioned, aircraft engines are not cheap for airlines to acquire, and they're not cheap to invest in to develop change. There's a long period of time to deliver change. And over the last 20, 30 years, there's been big improvements, but we really have to ratchet that up right now to another level. And sadly, electricity, which I'm sure we'll hear more about from panelists today, is likely to be not only further down the track, but typically the smaller aircraft. Hydrogen, which could be used more widely, has many challenges, not least the volume of the gas or the gas in liquefied form, the requirements for infrastructure to produce it and distribute it, and of course a new safety protocol as well. We've got to work hard and as quickly as possible to deliver those things safely, but we have to work more pragmatically on things like the air traffic control improvement, like engine efficiency with current fuels, and SAF's sustainable aviation fuel, which I don't think the industry is trying to put its eggs in all in one box, so to speak. I think they recognise the need for plurality, but the value of those elements, SAFs in particular, is that they can be used on the wing ready, but with engines and aircraft as they are today, and through the life cycle approach to emissions on those fuels, there can be very real progress, but that's not to park or put aside the need to do other things, because it's not the only solution. There are many political challenges and resource challenges even about that too. So it's a multifaceted approach we need. It is, I believe, now being taken by industry leaders with the utmost seriousness, but to get that political engagement, we're not remotely there yet. We're hearing governments saying the right things. We're hearing positive things, for example, in the USA about incentivizing SAF production, the UK government talking about Jet Zero, for example, and similar efforts in other parts of the world. But we've got to see some real meat on the bones so that they can actually start to deliver as a matter of urgency right now.
John, thanks for that. It just occurs to me that most people see aviation as a very large, very wealthy industry. It's not managed itself perhaps very well because it's pursued numbers rather than yield, and therefore it's not been able to reinvest. But we've seen this problem coming, John. It's not new. You know, the Stern report in 2006, when I looked it up recently, I was horrified to see it was so long ago, clearly made the case that the sooner you started to solve these problems, the cheaper it would be. It's been left until 5 minutes to midnight, with Biden telling us that we're now in the critical decade and that Biden is doing a lot from the States. But to what extent do you think it is realistic to expect government to solve the problems for an industry which has not invested in new technology, perhaps in the way it should have done?
Well, I dispute the fact that the industry has been very profitable. It has grown, but that's not the same thing as profitability. Indeed, that's really the challenge of the industry. Margins have been slim. You see exceptions with certain airline groups, not least some of the low-cost carriers, or groups like IAG, the parent company here in Europe of British Airways and Iberia, who have delivered higher levels of profitability. And indeed, they are the ones who equally are investing either in new aircraft right now of the types that are currently available that give the most efficiency and using them in the best way. But that has to be widened to the weaker brethren, of which we're going to be even more now. Yes, some of those weaker brethren arguably should fail, but sometimes governments have the political ego or will to keep them alive. So we're not certainly going by the laws of the jungle in terms of the composition of the industry, but I think globally the issue is understood. And I certainly don't think it's down to the government to solve it for the industry, but they do have to work with the industry, because it's in the hands of government to decide about how, where, and to what extent they tax. And that's where the industry needs a far more collaborative approach. I mean, the EU has put out its framework of Fit for 55 to reduce emissions by 55% across society. And the transport industry buys into that, but they do see it's still too much of a punitive approach. It's not recognizing enough that, yes, there is a will. At the end of the day, it's human beings who are running airlines. It's airline managers who have children who are going into this possible existential crisis we face. It's in everybody's interest to work quickly on this. So it's a matter of working hand in hand, one, for governments to understand the complexity of the challenge to produce aircraft, engines, fuels. That does take years, decades indeed, to achieve, but that's why we have to have public resources in combination with what the industry can provide, and indeed industry partners as well. We're even seeing some businesses who know they're going to continue to travel, who are willing to invest, for example, in SAFs, if they know that they can use that to actually improve their own credentials in travel.
Thanks, John. Adam, could we come to you in Manchester Airport? How do you see it? Because presumably there's quite a lot you can do on the ground to reduce the carbon associated with aviation. But in the end, you'll also have to be the place that refuels the aircraft and gets them serviced. How optimistic are you about the future on the basis of what you've seen at Manchester, which I believe has quite a good reputation for having worked hard to reduce the carbon impact of its operations?
Hi, Harold, and thanks for the introduction. Yes, I think the challenge of climate change is one that we all collectively face as an industry, but also individually as different organisations. Airports, if you like, are the fixed location on the ground around which the industry kind of centres, albeit a number of locations. And that's why I think as an airport group, MAG, which operates Manchester, East Midlands and London Stansted airports, is really deeply connected to its communities. So if you like, the decarbonisation journey of aviation is going to unlock the continued success of the communities around airports. And we've seen some of them hit particularly hard actually during the COVID pandemic over the last year or so. So decarbonisation is key to their success, green skills, green jobs for local people at their local airport, front and centre for us. And I'd start actually, Harold, by saying that airports aren't new to decarbonisation, nor do I think actually as the broader industry. Back in 2006, around the same time as the Stern Review, which you mentioned earlier, MAG became the first UK airport group to commit to carbon neutrality. Since then, we've been implementing really wide-ranging energy efficiency programs. Some of you may have seen the lights switch off rather awkwardly around me a moment or two ago. At Manchester now, we use about half the energy across the airport campus that we used to back in the 1990s, at the same time as having grown really significantly, opened a second runway and grown massively as a business. So real success in that space. We've introduced renewable energy, about a decade now of using renewable electric across our airports, got our own wind turbines at East Midlands. We got to carbon neutrality at East Midlands in 2012, 2015 in Manchester, and then taking the programme we'd rolled out at our existing airports after we acquired Stansted, they became carbon neutral as well. So real success story for us. We're not all the way there yet. Of course, we have residual emissions. We've committed to remove those and become net zero carbon by 2038. So 12 years ahead of the national target, which has been set by the government as an organisation. But of course, our emissions are only a very small part of the broader industry. And we recognise that is why MAG is a founding member of the UK Coalition Sustainable Aviation, a past chair of that organisation, a very active contributor, as I know other speakers on this call are, to its work. And last year, I think we were really pleased to see, under MAG's leadership, Sustainable Aviation publish its decarbonisation roadmap, which sets out how the UK aviation industry sees aircraft emissions decarbonising through to 2050. We were really pleased as well to see the government announce the creation of the Jet Zero Council last year, more recently consultation on a Jet Zero strategy, and also mandates for sustainable aviation fuels. So very significant progress within the industry, and we're seeing similar progress overseas as well, which is promising. But as you say, some challenges for airports. We are the location at which aeroplanes need to take on board energy. At the moment, fuel, kerosene, fossil-based kerosene generally. In the short term, we see some really significant opportunity to introduce sustainable aviation fuels, which can be 60 to 80% lower life cycle carbon emissions than jet fuel. There are some challenges around that, of course. We need to see the government stepping forwards to support the investment in first-of-a-kind production facilities. That is critical. Everybody wants to invest in the third or fourth plants, but nobody's keen to be the first mover, perhaps. So we do need to see that support, and the SAF mandates, which were proposed recently, are a helpful first step in that direction. Hydrogen, I'm sure others will talk about on this session, is also very promising. It could be truly sustainable if it's produced in an appropriate way. It will, of course, help with local air quality around airports and more broadly, which is promising as well. But presents some challenges, because at the moment, airports are set up to very safely fuel aircraft with conventional fuels. SAF is a drop-in alternative. It's effectively the same as a fossil jet fuel. So we're already set up to accommodate that. You could bring it here today to Manchester, to any other airport, and we could accommodate it. Hydrogen's quite different. It's cryogenic. It's very cold when it's stored. It's got some potential safety challenges which need to be overcome. There are, of course, procedures which we can put in place, but they could be operationally disruptive. So we need to overcome some of those headaches. But I do think the industry is fully committed to doing so. The challenge is how we do that in a reasonably short order of time. And it's really pleasing actually to see that the government's on board with this journey. BAEs have supported an industry programme called Fly Zero, which is very active in this space. And similarly, the Department for Transport through the Connected Places Catapult are active in this space as well at the moment. So there's definitely action underway, and it will be really pleasing, I think, to see our airports take a lead in that, because the challenges we face around hydrogen, and to a lesser extent electric aircraft, because they will have infrastructure requirements as well that we need to accommodate, all collectively need to be addressed through airport master plans. And at MAG, we're going to be embarking upon our next round of master plans over the coming year or two for each of the 3 airports. And I'm keen that as we do so, we consider the land requirements, for example, of hydrogen fuel farms. Where might we put those on our airports? What do we need to consider when we're looking at those locations? And then as an airport community, we reach out to our regional stakeholders and consider how hydrogen could be produced, how it gets to the airport before it's put onto the aircraft ultimately. So some real opportunity, also some challenges, but absolute commitment from MAG, and as we see it, also the broader industry, to get there quickly. I would come back just before I close, Harold, to one of the points John made actually around airspace modernisation. There in the Sustainable Aviation Roadmap are some really clear wedges if you take a look at the graphic. And one of those is operational improvements, largely delivered through airspace modernisation, if not delivered through airspace modernisation, unlocked by. And if you look at the roadmap, actually, airspace modernisation and those operational efficiencies deliver about 20% of the industry's decarbonisation this decade. So really important that we get on with those programmes at each of our 3 airports, more broadly across other UK airports, and as you rightly say, Harold, internationally with our colleagues in Europe and further afield to truly achieve some of those system efficiencies, which at the minute we're struggling with simply because of the age of the systems which we're operating within.
Thanks, Adam. If I could just come back to you on something that John said, and you picked it up already. I was looking at that BA flight that took place recently, and 28% of that increased efficiency was from sustainable aviation fuels, 38% from offsets, let's not go there, but 34% came from more efficient operation of the aircraft and more efficient engines. And we hear a lot about the fact that the problem is apparently the air traffic control systems. When I've been delayed at airports around Europe, it's always the air traffic control system. But I just wondered if you had any sense, Adam, of to what extent it's problems on the ground, whether it's a late incoming flight, whether it's problems in security or baggage handling. How many of the inefficiencies in the operational system are actually down either to the airports or to the airlines? It can't all be the air traffic control system.
I think you're probably right. There's a very broad definition, if you like, which lay people perhaps perceive to be air traffic controllers, but is actually the broader system. And that system is delivered by a plethora of different organisations, from check-in right through to when you're getting on your coach to your hotel at the other end of your journey. There are hundreds of different organisations at different touch points, either delivering IT systems or putting your bag on and off the aircraft. So there are lots of opportunities for things to arguably go wrong or delays to creep in. We're really keen on delivering programs such as ACDM, collaborative decision-making programs, which give all of those stakeholders a clear view as to what's going on within the operation of any one flight, so they can make the decisions they need to keep things on time. What I would say though, Harold, is that the air traffic control organisations themselves, and at East Midlands, that includes us because we operate our own in-house air traffic control unit at East Midlands actually, but also NAPS and other partners more broadly are fully committed to this journey to decarbonisation as well. And we've been working with them for a number of years. Actually in Manchester, we worked with NAPS, who are our air traffic control provider here, with Flybe, actually at the time as an operator, and with Bombardier to seek type certification approval for their Dash 8 aircraft to single engine taxi across active runways so that they could use our second runway at Manchester. And those sorts of procedures deliver something in the order of a 40% carbon reduction and also air quality improvements as a result, because airlines are able to taxi using fewer than all of their engines. And of course, there are other benefits, noise benefits for our local communities as well. So the industry as a whole is fully committed. Sure, delays creep in. We hope there'll be fewer of them as technology moves forwards. But I don't think delays are the only reason that the industry needs to take action to decarbonise. There are lots of other opportunities as well.
Howard, can I just add quickly to what Adam says? So there are a myriad of ground factors which contribute to delays, but the challenge we face is we have an air traffic system that was designed decades ago. Aircraft technology is something that has been invested in terms of separations of aircraft, efficiency of routing within the planes themselves. The industry, airlines have spent money on that, but we've got an air traffic system, particularly in Europe, but in some other parts of the world as well, designed around nation states. It's designed around national boundaries, and that leads to enormous inefficiency in transferring flights between one air traffic control center and another, and these indirect circuitous routings, not to mention military airspace as well. So that's the biggest nut that needs to be cracked, and has been most elusive so far with politicians, certainly in Europe and the US.
The one thing that none of us are going to be able to manage, however, is the weather. And with more extreme weather events, it seems to me that some of the problems about making airlines run on schedule are going to get more difficult. as we go through the impact of climate change. But Keith, could we maybe come to you next? I'm hoping you're going to cheer me up by talking about what Airbus is doing. I'm extremely excited by the hydrogen agenda, but I don't want to prejudge what you'd like to say.
Thank you, Harold. Thank you, everybody. I think it's quite an exciting time for the industry as a whole. I know we've been through some terrible situations recently with COVID, but the industry is beginning to emerge from this. And the challenge for us is quite vast. However, we believe at Airbus that we are certainly up for the challenge. Our strapline is that we are pioneering for a sustainable aerospace for a sustainable future, and very much working with colleagues in airlines and airports and manufacturers from engine manufacturers right across the whole piece. Working collaboratively is the key to actually delivering a decarbonised aviation industry. We cannot do this on our own. And recently we've launched a partnership which includes EasyJet, Vancy Airport and Air Liquide, looking at the opportunity for delivering hydrogen flight. Let me just take you back. A year ago, just over a year ago, in September 2020, Airbus announced that we were looking to develop hydrogen-powered zero-emissions aircraft. We're still looking at 3 demonstrations, 3 key types of aircraft, a smaller 100-seater aircraft of a regional style, a conventional jet aircraft, and then a blended wing body. And each of these concepts we're continuing to evaluate to understand the opportunity for them. However, what we have stated is that by 2035 we will be launching one of these aircraft into service. The challenge for the industry is not the industry itself. The challenge is decarbonisation. The challenge is carbon. Not the fuel per se, it is decarbonisation, and we need to focus on that. And as part of sustainable aviation, we have been working over the last decade on decarbonising the industry, and we've seen some significant opportunities and significant results. I think the roadmap which we launched in February, on February the 4th last year, was another step forward. And it was the first opportunity, the first industry to actually announce a roadmap to net zero by 2050. And where we looked at all the various pillars that we are going to need to work on to decarbonise, from air traffic management, new, more efficient aircraft. So the current generation of aircraft, which are going into service now, are 20 to 25% more efficient for the ones that they replace. So we're already seeing significant reductions and significant opportunities for decarbonisation. The next generation aircraft, as we've talked about with respect to hydrogen, will offer us zero emissions flight. And that's extremely exciting and still a real challenge, The engineers at Airbus are quite excited because these challenges are large, but we need to overcome them. And we have many engineers working on these challenges to overcome them. I think the other opportunity which we're looking at, sustainable aviation fuels, I think it's important to say that there's a myriad of difference in sustainable aviation fuels from waste, which we focus on in the UK, but other forms of sustainable fuels for biomass. And also there's an opportunity for a hydrogen part of this, which is power to liquid fuels. And these fuels are where you manufacture the hydrogen from renewable electricity, and then you add this to carbon, which is being captured either from an industrial source or from direct air carbon capture to produce a sustainable fuel, a power to liquid fuel that can be used for long haul flight. What we see across the board is that there's different solutions for different distances. On the shortest haul, we would see the opportunity for hydrogen fuel cells and for electric. For short to medium haul, direct hydrogen burn, and on long haul, looking at sustainable fuels, power to liquid fuels, and fuels from waste. What is interesting is the ATI, the UK's research organisation, and the Fly Zero part of it, have recently announced or recently reported that they believe that the technical feasibility for hydrogen is up to 5,250 nautical miles from a technical point of view. Now, the economic viability of that is not part of that decision or part of that statement. However, from a technical point of view, we're looking at over 5,000 nautical miles can be achieved on hydrogen. Zero emissions flight up to 5,000 miles. I do think there's one other area which perhaps we haven't touched upon, and that is direct air carbon capture or carbon capture and storage. And Airbus have recently joined the Coalition for Negative Emissions, which we believe is another key part of the decarbonisation story. So there's no silver bullet to decarbonisation. There's no one solution. There's lots of opportunity. We need to work collaboratively, and we are fostering that opportunity across the board with our collaborations. But we see that the future of aviation is secure, providing we have the right policies in place from governments. In a few months' time, we will have next year we will have the ICAO General Summit, where we're looking at announcing the long-term aspirational goal. Now, we as the industry want to see that being net zero by 2050 across the board. But there's challenges for that. There's challenges for emerging industries. There's challenging for emerging nations to actually decarbonise. But we as industry are fully committed, and Airbus fully committed to decarbonisation by 2050. No ifs, no buts, with a variety of opportunities from air traffic management, sustainable aviation fuels, new aircraft, hydrogen technology, and direct air carbon capture and storage, and the opportunity to develop power to liquid fuel. So there's a whole myriad of opportunities to decarbonise, and each one of them plays their part.
Just a couple of questions, maybe, Keith, to follow up with you on this. I mean, one of the problems for aviation is, well, the opportunities as well. It's not just a problem. The challenge, perhaps, for aviation is that we know it wants to grow rapidly, so that in order even to grow and not increase its emissions of carbon, the technology really has to move perhaps more quickly than it does for some other sectors. And that seems to me to be a challenge. And related to that is the problem of what do you do with all the planes which are currently, as you've said, mothballed. They're often sat in a desert somewhere being looked after, but they haven't actually been scrapped. And I wonder if Airbus has a view about what's likely to happen to, if you like, second-hand aircraft.
So that's an interesting question, because Airbus is part of had a number of projects for end of life of aircraft, and AFRA, which is the industry body, has a set of standards. However, the projects that we're working with Tarmac actually recycle over 90% of aircraft are now recyclable. The challenges that we see in recyclability primarily down to carbon fiber. But even now, we're able to recycle that carbon fiber, not to industrial grade carbon fiber, but to opportunities for it to be used in other areas. So the aircraft which are stored or which are going to be scrapped, 90%, over 90% can be recycled and reused. So we do see that as an industry that we can become sustainable. The challenge is to get to that 100% recyclability and reuse. And we're working very hard, as I said, with Tarmac to make that happen. With respect to aircraft which are mothballed, what we are seeing is that airlines are starting to reuse and restart their most efficient aircraft. And we've seen the ones which are least efficient, the ones which are taken out of service. And so, you know, that's not a bad thing when it comes to climate. And at Airbus, we're continually improving our product range. Each of our aircraft are 20 to 25% more efficient than the ones that they replace. So when an airline purchases our new aircraft, they significantly reduce their carbon impact, which is great for climate, great for the environment. The industry, as part of sustainable aviation, when we launched our report on the 4th of February last year, there was a significant opportunity for growth, even to get to that net zero. So we had incorporated that already. What we don't believe is there should be a cap on movements. the industry needs to continue to grow organically, and we can take the opportunity to decarbonize. We have the technology. We are developing the technology for zero emissions flight. We have the opportunity to use sustainable fuels now. We are beginning to see the right policies come into place. The Department for Transport have been extremely proactive and working very hard with industry to come up with the right policies in order to incentivize. And I think Adam talked about the necessity for sustainable aviation fuel plants. In a report that we published with, and we had the report which we used, E4Tech, a consultancy, which we asked to investigate the opportunity for sustainable aviation fuel refineries, that by 2038 there could be 14 refineries manufacturing sustainable aviation fuel in this country, in 7 clusters around the country. And then post 2038, as we move away from municipal solid waste, but to power to liquid fuels, these are adjacent or associated with wind farms, offshore wind. And we see the generation of sustainable electricity from them actually being able to make power to liquid fuels as another part of the decarbonisation story. I don't want to forget that hydrogen is going to, from 2035 onwards, is going to really significantly move forward, and we'll see the fleet being penetrated by these new zero emissions aircraft. I think the aircraft which are coming out of service, again, we're working very hard to look at the recyclability of them. And what we do now in our design process is design for recyclability. So the end of life is always factored into the design phase of the aircraft.
Maybe a question which links what I think Jane is going to want to talk about, Keith, with what you've been talking about, is how do we, I'm going to ask the question on another panel today about people who are still building hotels which are not environmentally very smart. I mean, people are still buying aircraft which seem to me to be not very environmentally smart. How does Airbus see that? People are they're still full order books for planes which are going to be really problematic going forward, aren't they?
Well, I'm not sure that I agree. So the aircraft the new aircraft that people are purchasing now, as I said, are 20 to 25% more efficient than the ones that they replace. The typical life of an aircraft is sort of 30 to 40 years. So the aircraft flying today will still be flying in 2040, 2050 maybe. Some of them will be. However, they're already, as I said, more efficient. And then we consider the opportunity for sustainable aviation fuels for some of those aircraft. And then we look at the challenge when it comes to carbon capture and storage. So I don't see a conflict between purchasing aircraft today and using them in the future when we have the opportunity for sustainable fuels and to decarbonize through removing carbon from the atmosphere. So it's a decreasing carbon story. But we are seeing the industry has already announced that by 2030 we will be around 15% more efficient, 15% less carbon, and then by 2040 we will be 40% more efficient with less carbon, and then reaching net zero emissions by 2050. Now, it's not a nice straight line, which we would like to see, because it's going to take those 10 to 20 years to develop the new technologies, to get the sustainable aviation fuel plants up and running, to see the changes, to get the right policies in place. All these things need to happen, but ultimately we will hit that net zero by 2050 using all the pillars that we've already talked about.
Thanks, Keith. That's very reassuring. I'm assuming that in that, power to liquid is going to be a big part of the solution over the flying of those planes,
particularly for long haul flight. For short haul flight, we have electric at the smallest, shortest range, but hydrogen, direct hydrogen burn, at the sort of the short to medium range. So there's a solution right across the board.
Yeah, Jane, you've been very patient, waiting to come to you, but you are, if you like, the end user of all of this. Collectively, on our behalf, I've flown on EasyJet more than a few times, and you do the purchasing for me. and determine the choices that I can make as a consumer by the aircraft you choose. Presumably, it's quite good news for EasyJet, isn't it? If these hydrogen-powered planes are going to be able to fly up to 5,000 nautical miles, that would cover most of your operations, I think.
Oh, absolutely. Our average journey distance is more like 1.2, 1.3 thousand nautical miles. So absolutely, we're really excited about the possibility of hydrogen propulsion from the 2035 onwards, and we're committed to integrate those planes into our fleet, obviously providing they're commercially viable. But in the meantime, there's a huge amount we can be doing, but it's also a huge challenge. And you know, as you say, tourism creates massive wealth worldwide, and not flying is not the answer. And whilst there might be talk about not flying, what we've seen is customers still continue to want to fly, but they want to fly as environmentally efficiently as possible. And what we've also seen over the last, well, over the time of the pandemic actually, is the escalation in people's consciousness about the issues of climate change. I think in future, the visibility of the climate performance of different airlines and the transparency is going to be really, really important. And I think also carbon literacy. I think most people aren't aware, if they're actually traveling on holiday, that sort of 80 to 90% plus of the carbon footprint of their holiday is in the airline portion. So, you know, I think there's going to be increased demand for transparency and information about what airlines are doing to address that carbon performance.
Okay, one of the things which I think has just happened in the last couple of weeks is that EasyJet have come out talking about their responsible holidays program. And that's a really interesting opportunity, isn't it, to combine the control over the flight element, which is such a big part of the negative impacts of their holidays, because of the carbon, not because of the plane, but because of the carbon, with the opportunity to produce a genuinely responsible holiday in the destination. Are you excited by that? I mean, your original background was in tour operating. Do you see that as a massive commercial opportunity?
Yes, absolutely. And when you see the trend in consumer awareness and concern, I think it's got to be part of the differentiation and part of the proposition. I mean, I think you mentioned beforehand about airlines sticking their head in the sand about this over the last couple of decades. But actually, when I look at the carbon performance of EasyJet, between 2000 and 2019, the CO2 per passenger kilometre reduced by about a third. And we're working really hard on a net zero trajectory, understanding both from an industry perspective and from an individual airline perspective what the different levers are that we're going to need to pull to reach net zero by 2050. And doing that in a really sort of systematic way with strategy departments and the technical departments to understand how much can be derived through ongoing operational efficiencies, how much through improved ATM, how much through fleet replacement, through sustainable aviation fuels, and then you know, most excitingly through investment and infrastructure for hydrogen powered aircraft, and we've got MOUs, for instance, with a number of players, but most importantly with Airbus, helping them shape from an operational perspective the requirements of those new aircraft, and then that's all going to take a while. The next 10 to 15 years, you know, going to be key before the new propulsion comes online. In the meanwhile, and Harold, you and I have debates about this, but I think in the meanwhile, offsetting is, as long as it's on top of all those efforts to decarbonise, is something that the industry can do here and now. And EasyJet was the first major airline worldwide to offset all the carbon emissions from its operations, and also now from EasyJet holiday portion of the holiday. So because I think keeping carbon locked up is absolutely critical. Land use change for industrial agriculture and animal feed is the second biggest source of greenhouse gas emissions. So it is one of the levers that we can pull now to start to compensate for the carbon emissions which we can't remove immediately or in the next sort of 2 decades, really. So that is an element.
Jane, you're absolutely right. We have been discussing this, you and I, for a long time. I wasn't going to use the EasyJet example because it would seem impolite, but I did notice that Jet2 had come out saying that they were going to offset all the carbon from their flights, and it was going to cost roughly the cost of a cup of coffee that they had to add on to each flight. One of the problems is, sorry, let me finish the point. One of the problems is that there are carbon offsets out there which are incredibly cheap and a very attractive solution for people who perhaps don't want to move as rapidly as we need to move towards reducing emissions.
Yes, and I think you'll find with Jet2, they're offsetting the carbon that's not already covered by legislative carbon schemes, but so it would be it's not offsetting 100% of the carbon emissions, but also I think there definitely will be more governance and more professionalism in the carbon offset industry over the next couple of decades. I think legislators and public would all agree that conserving the rainforests and helping developing countries invest in renewable energies is absolutely an important lever that we have to pull, but it has to come on top of the carbon reduction. And I think you'll find carbon, be it carbon offsets or emitting carbon, is obviously going to become more and more expensive over the next couple of decades, so it won't remain so cheap.
I think your point is well made about the need for airlines to actually reveal their carbon emissions per flight. I just hope it can be done in a way that makes the difference between what the airline has actually saved and what it's offset, because it does seem to me that offsetting is something which should be done with the very smallest amount of residual carbon which cannot be removed, maybe from the oil that's used to lubricate the engine or whatever. There's always going to be a little carbon, but it does seem to me that we need a mechanism for making sure that we don't just ignore the importance of decarbonising by solving the problem cheaply elsewhere. We're into the last 10 minutes, Jane, so I'm going to just maybe pose one final question and give you a chance all to have your final say, as it were, as we go around, and I'll go around in the same way that we started. It worries me slightly that several of you mentioned the importance of increasing carbon literacy amongst the consumers, and I think that's absolutely right. I don't think we help that process when we talk about net zero, zero carbon, decarbonising. It's all very complicated, and net zero worries me particularly because it makes no distinction between actual reductions in carbon and mechanisms of sequestering carbon, perhaps, but all of the schemes which are out there. And it seems to me somehow we need to get to much more clarity about what we mean by these terms and use them in a consistent way. And that's not a criticism of any of you individually. It seems to be a generic problem at the moment around the carbon debate. But John, we're into the last 10 minutes, so your chance to have your final say, on this panel at least.
I think we've discussed it quite widely today. I hope we can see from that the conviction that is there by the industry to make changes. And as Jane said, to your point earlier, Howard, I don't think the industry has been sitting on its hands or had its head in the sands, ostrich-like. It's been trying for quite some time, but the pace is quickening inevitably, and certainly we've only seen too many visual examples of the impact of climate change this year. I think it's very clearly in people's minds, but we do need to see that political imperative. We need to see at a global level through ICAO, the aviation body of UN, a far stronger mandate about actions. We need to see governments put their hand in their pocket or very least put in tax structures to incentivize change. The risk is we could also simply get competition between countries. I mean, the Biden administration is making it very clear they will offer tax breaks for the setting up of sustainable aviation fuel production. We don't want to find this becomes a tit for tat between countries. And I think the final point I would make is I think it has to be clearly understood how much aviation is part of the fabric of 21st century life. It is not a toy for the few well-heeled privileged travelers. Certainly there is that part of the market, but if we look at even what is surviving now through COVID, it is big domestic markets of travel in countries like the USA, yes, certainly first world, but Russia and China, and when we see the growth of middle classes where wealth is going into a wider base of the population's hands, very rightly, people want to travel, and aviation is most typically the means to do so. I'm certainly not saying it should always be aviation. We have to be multimodal, but aviation performs a very key role to facilitate that human desire to travel. And of course, it contributes then, of course, as I said earlier, to the importance of tourism, which thank goodness has become a major part of many countries' success and which has been so sadly damaged by the COVID crisis. So it's got to be a multifaceted approach, and hand in hand, a continuous effort to work between the air transport industry and the politicians of this world, who sadly have lifespans less than most airlines, and certainly less than this challenge we face as a species.
Multifaceted and more transparent, one hopes.
Absolutely.
Adam, what would you like to say
Harold.
by way of concluding?
Well, I think we're at an important moment now where climate change has shifted from something that scientists used to talk about in white coats in dark corners to a topic which most people have a general understanding of. Carbon literacy sure is an issue, but people now are much more familiar with climate change and the need for climate mitigation and adaptation, to a point where I think we're at risk of climate becoming, I say that as a scientist, perhaps popular culture. And the industry is absolutely responding to that shift. The pace of action is increasing, which is something that we certainly welcome and embrace. We do, though, need to, I think, remain grounded in the fact that climate change is an impact that is felt globally. Some locations will feel climate change much more significantly than others, but carbon emissions act upon the global climate. And I think that's why the right target for us is net zero carbon, to allow the aviation industry and other industries to decarbonize truly in the most speedy way possible for them, but to share the benefits of those who are able to decarbonize more quickly with some of those who aren't. And aviation, unfortunately, is a more highly regulated, safety-dependent industry, which will take slightly longer to decarbonize. So the right target, as I see it, is absolutely net zero carbon. That is no overall climate impact from aviation, as we've committed by 2050. There's lots happening in that space. We're progressing as airports in decarbonizing ground infrastructure, getting ready for zero carbon aircraft of the future, be that electric, hydrogen, or in the shorter and longer term sustainable aviation fuels. And that's why, I guess, as MAG, we set last year our competition, offering 5 years of free landing fees to the first airline who brings us a zero carbon aircraft to a MAG airport, which I think is a really helpful incentive to say, hey, look, we're into this. We hope you are too. Please come to our airports, work with us. I do, though, sympathise with the view that carbon literacy is something we need to work on. It's something which I know John, Jane and Keith have all touched on actually in their moments or two of speaking. And it's something that we've committed through our CSR strategy to address through sustainability league tables, which encompass noise as well as climate impacts, and something that we've been working on for a while actually with the guys at the Plain English campaign, who have for some time now crystal marked all sorts of MAG's public material, most recently working with us on our future airspace project. So I wonder whether there's something we could perhaps work on collectively as an industry around some of these messages to see whether we could help bridge that gap perhaps.
It would be nice to think that I could look on the Manchester Airport website when booking a flight from there and see which was the most carbon efficient airline. Keith, we are really coming to the end of our time, so a quick response would be really helpful, Keith.
So I think it's really important that we continue to focus on the enemy, and the enemy is carbon and not the aviation industry. We have tremendous positives for the industry, connecting people globally, and we should never forget that. And as an industry, we're completely committed to that decarbonisation journey. However, we're not going to do this as one individual company. We can only do this through collaboration. There are a number of solutions. There's no one single solution. Air traffic management, sustainable fuels, hydrogen, more efficient aircraft, carbon capture and carbon removals. All of these things will decarbonise the industry, and we will see a net zero future by 2050 for the industry. The big challenge going forward is getting that commitment next year from ICAO, of the states and the countries committing to that net zero future, and that's what we want to see.
Thanks very much. Jane, you've got the last word.
Yeah, and Harold, you were concerned about the challenges reaching transparency in carbon reporting and the complexity to do with net zero. I think we will see a lot more clarity over the next months with COP26 and in the next years with regard to the rigor of carbon reporting and the comparability of carbon reporting. You've got the net zero standards coming out. You've got the science-based target initiative, sectoral decarbonisation pathway for aviation, which has just been published. We should be seeing airlines start to set rigorous science-based targets, which need to be then approved by the SBTi. Legislation doesn't allow you to net off your offsets against your actual emissions, so they will be reported separately. So I'm hoping that there'll be more transparency and probably then a bit more competitiveness in terms of airlines seeking to rigorously reduce their carbon. Already flying on a low-cost carrier, you're 30% plus more carbon efficient on a per kilometre basis than the legacy airlines. So there is a big discrepancy, but I'm hoping there'll be more transparency, more rigour, more visibility, and more progress as we move forward. But there's still tremendous challenges ahead.
Could I finish this just by thanking you all? We don't need to come to any conclusion today about the best way forward. It's clear that there are lots of different ways forward. I hope that the people who've watched this have found it enlightening. I wanted it to be an educational experience rather than anything else. But it does seem to me that one of the things we probably could agree about at the end of this session is that provided transparency and more literacy about carbon would be helpful not only to driving change in the aviation industry, but probably across all the other industries which are similarly struggling to decarbonise at the moment. But thank you very much indeed for participating in this panel today. I'm sure that the people who watch it will find it really interesting, and it will be both on Dcarbonise and on the WTM platforms going forward. So thank you very much.